turned therapists. Our focus in these episodes is to humanize the athlete experience beyond the lines of their arena. In this podcast, we will explore the whole athlete, highlighting the mental, emotional, and social aspects of their journey.
Hello, and welcome back to the Millennium Counseling Podcast. This is Alessandra, one of the interns, and I am with Thomas today, one of the primary therapists here, and we're going to be talking a little bit of loss of identity and sense of purpose pertaining to sports, and I'll hand it on off to Thomas.
Thank you, Sasa. I think one of the most important factors when talking about athletes is recognizing the impact that comes with leaving the sport or that transition post finishing up their sport. And I think with the work I've done with so many of my clients focuses on, managing that transition that comes with leaving their sport, leaving college, and what that means for them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the major things or topics that I've noticed with so many athletes once they leave or transition out of their sport is the loss of identity that comes with that transition. And I think it's important to understand how identity loss plays a big role in an athlete's life because of how much they've dedicated their life and time to their sport. So when looking and understanding identity loss, one of the major things to understand is it's one of the most significant psychological challenges faced by athletes when they step away from their sport. Many athletes derive a primary sense of self from their role as an athlete. And when this aspect of life is gone, what I've noticed and what I see is that they struggle to understand who they are outside of their athletic achievements. And, just to give a quick understanding of how identity loss can show up, I can give a quick example from my own experience of creating a new identity, I think, in college, right? I think coming out of high school, being in a whole new arena of people, for me, college was one of those places where I felt so free, where it was like the people I'm meeting have no understanding of who I was before this. You pretty much create friends for life there. The community is around you. You're walking distance from your friends all the time. And those were easily one of the best 4 years of my life. And once I left college, I remember feeling this heavy sense of emptiness, where not only when I look at my future, it's more of looking at what do I do now, right? The people around me are now gone. There's no sense of community that you once had. And that makes you feel like, what am I going to do? How am I going to create this new identity now that I'm in Chicago? And one of the biggest challenges that came with that was managing the emotions around identity loss. So for me, I know within my 4 years, I've created an identity in college, and shifting from that identity was so challenging because those 4 years were really used to figure out who I was. And then once you step out of there, you kind of realize that that person that you were in college may not be the most ideal person in the professional workforce, or, it may not lend to creating a new identity once you transition out of there. And for me, that was just 4 years of my life. I can only imagine for an athlete who's been doing this for probably since they were 5 to 6 and coming out of college at, ages 21, 22, 23, 24, trying to understand what life is without their sport, where we see how much the sport really transforms them, is their identity, is their purpose, right? Sasa, I know you were an athlete. And for you, can you tell me a little bit about how that transition was for you once you left your sport?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of really touch upon some of the aspects that when I reflect back on, my athletic identity and, when I was playing sports growing up, was the community aspect. And, like you were saying with being in college, being surrounded by so much of your friends. And that kind of relates to the, athlete mind of so much of your friends are your teammates or can be your teammates because of the amount of time you're spending with them and the proximity and also the commonality things of, what you guys are interested in. And so the shared common interest of the sport and the love of the sport and also just the time you're spending together is really prominent when you're an athlete. And when you're removed from that space, there can almost feel like there's a missing puzzle piece, a little bit of it. And, it's also a reflection of, possibly the relationships and community that you had was because of the sport, and also just the amount of time you were spending and kind of finding your way of how to have those connections still without that common factor of the sport.
Yeah.
And, also like reflecting back on kind of how I ended my soccer career back in high school. It was kind of a few things together. One of them was a little bit of injury and having the realization, and I didn't necessarily have the goals and strive to go play soccer past high school, because I knew the colleges I wanted to study at, I didn't necessarily know that I was gonna play.
Yeah.
So I was kind of think of it on a realistic level of that, and also injury. Knowing if I wanted to continue playing, it was more likely going to hurt me more than enjoyment of playing. And since I played for so long too, kind of instead of it being enjoyment at that point, it was kind of leading to burnout.
Yeah.
And also just the community aspect. I remember it was, I believe it was junior year tryouts, and kind of the impact of the coach's mentality of things. I wasn't really on board with a lot of the things that they kind of enforced. And I remember it was like halfway through tryouts, and I remember I ended the second day of tryouts, and I told myself, I was like, I'm not going to go back to tryouts tomorrow. And I kind of was like, I'm kind of done at that point. Not saying like the quitting self, but I kind of just came to the realization that I didn't necessarily want to play anymore, because the enjoyment was kind of gone in that aspect.
And I think going off of that, right, I can imagine that, even though you've made that decision yourself, it still is a different lifestyle once you leave and get out of there, because there's so many aspects that are involved with playing a sport, like competition, camaraderie, all of these things that you're choosing to let go of to kind of transition to this next phase. I'm hearing you said that decision was made your junior year of high school, and senior year, or did you not play then your junior year at all?
I didn't play junior year. I essentially the last time I truly played would be sophomore year. And I mean, I grew up playing soccer since I was 4 years old. So it was, well over a decade of my life I was playing this one singular sport. And so much of my childhood revolved around soccer. And a lot of that came with friends and whatnot. And the transition out of that, it was kind of like, what do I do with my time now that I'm not putting so much time into the sport? And I mean, that comes with a bunch of other challenges that came along with it, of kind of perception of like, what else can I do with my time? But also like, who else am I besides the soccer player?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads us to the first major impact that comes with, identity loss, which is the loss of purpose and direction. And so many times athletes feel so aimless and lack motivation when they don't have the structure that comes with their sport, right? So we're talking about having structured goals, schedules, and scheduling time for competition that pretty much defines who they are. So when we notice that aspect of your lives, so many of my clients' lives that I notice is taken out of their lives, there is that sense of emptiness, or that question of who am I and what do I do, right? And I think what's sometimes not understood by people like me who are not in the realm of being a high-level athlete is recognizing how much the sport not only dictates what you do in your life, but how much of it is so structured and tailored towards the schedule you have. And once that schedule is gone, it's up for the athletes to pretty much create their own schedule to manage their time well, which was for so many years defined by either the program, the college they're part of, the high school you're a part of. And when that athlete is put in that position to do it themselves, it's extremely daunting, it's taxing, and I've noticed that it leads to a lot of fear, right? Because you don't know what that next step is. You don't know how to take that next step. You don't even know how to structure your own life in certain ways. People will try to fill it up the same ways they did in college, but I don't think it feels the same way for the athlete. So there is that loss of, purpose in their lives where they're like, okay, before I had training, I have myself to work on constantly. And that was fueled by the college. And now when they leave that, there is no sense of structure in their lives. And when you don't have structure, which has been given to you for so long, there's a sense of loss that comes with that because how do you take that next step? And I think some things I've noticed with certain of my clients, like top level runners, is one of the things I noticed with him is that, he had gotten a job right outside of, college, knowing he was going to end, track at the time. And he obtained a job that he didn't seem too excited about, but was shocked that he got in, took that opportunity and just wanted to focus on creating a life outside of his work and, just create a lifestyle in Chicago now. And one of the major things I noticed with him is that, he's going on with his schedule, going on with his day, and he's doing things like going to work, coming back from work, trying to work out a little bit, going through the motions of a normal day. But there was this sense of like, I don't know what I'm doing. And from the outside, it sounded like, you're taking care and you're transitioning pretty well. Like it seems like from the other athletes I work with, you were one of them that moved on and, had your stuff together. But the more I worked with him, the more I realized like, no matter how much he performed at work or he did well with taking care of all of his, household chores, connecting with friends, there was this sense of loss that he consistently dealt with. And that loss came down to him not knowing what his purpose was. So when he hit a roadblock, when it came to, work, it was like everything kind of unraveled for him because a lot of the times with athletes, a lot of how they view hitting a roadblock with their sport is just, I'll work harder. I'll try to focus on the things that I screwed up that first time, and I'll try to move on from that point. But with the job, with other people now kind of looking down on you, and you're not determined by your athleticism, or you're not determined or, reflected upon based off of those things. It's now based off the work you provide in this other field. And it was a transition for him because no matter how much work he did, no matter how much, he felt like he could do for work, it never felt like it was enough. And he questioned himself at that point. He questioned the job. He questioned whether or not, this was the lifestyle for him because there's no running left in his life. He was a runner. And, I think when I noticed that loss of purpose and direction, it is daunting, right? It is one of those things that, it is one of those factors I feel that is probably one of the main factors that comes with identity loss because rebuilding a sense of self or purpose is a challenge that I think takes years to create. So for you, Sasa, like when you left your sport, or even if you can give examples of your family members who are in sport, did you notice at all the loss of purpose or direction they had once they transitioned out of their sport?
Yeah, I feel like, my personal experience and also kind of what you were touching on is when the athletic aspect is gone, that there's a little bit of emptiness. And it's kind of like what you were talking about, the lack of structure in the everyday routine, or, a little bit of kind of a missing piece of, what's next. And a lot of questions come up. It's, you can either look at it as a very daunting aspect to fill in that piece, or you can look at it as like freedom to do what's best for you next.
Yes.
So there's different perspectives of how to look at it. And, even with so much freedom, because especially as an athlete, and if you're a very high level athlete, much of your structure and of routine is already accounted for by other people telling you how to go about your day. And when you have all this freedom, it can even be daunting in that way too. And it's like I have to make the decision what to do now. And it's also direction of what I want instead of, what coaches or staff or whoever may be telling you what's best for you. And I guess like with my perspective on kind of going about filling in those pieces, it was, well, I mean, when I was in high school, like I always took academics pretty seriously, knowing that, you know, I was more focused on the universities I wanted to go to for academic wise than sports wise. But, I focused on, my academics, and then also focused on, just finding different things that I did enjoy. And, one of those things was like cooking. Like I just fell in love with cooking, and, maybe that kind of substituted my athletic identity with something else. And, you know, especially like towards the end of high school, like you're all about your friends too. And like I still had friends from soccer, but then I also created new friends outside of the soccer realm too.
Yeah.
And, you can joke about having different friend groups for different reasonings. And that was kind of one of the things with me was, spending time with things I enjoyed, like the cooking aspect, and also spending time with people that I enjoyed being around and having deeper conversations and relationships past sport.
Yeah. So I think you started rebuilding your sense of self by utilizing the energy that was focused on soccer to something else like cooking or creating a new community outside of soccer.
Yep.
And I think that is such a good example of rebuilding that new sense of self, which is one of the hardest parts for a lot of athletes. As you said, so much is determined by the community you have. And even identifying with people outside of the sports realm is a challenge for a lot of them, because a lot of the people they're around for most of their lives through their sport are like-minded individuals who have that drive, who have this determination. And with my clients, I've noticed that that transition out is also difficult because of the people they're around and not seeing that same level of determination. And that makes them question themselves and like, should I have this determination when I tried this hard at work? Should I try this hard with creating that community? And, with this loss of purpose and direction, I think one of the main things that come with that is the emotional distress or the psychological distress. And when you feel like there is no direction in your life, when you feel like there isn't that sense of purpose, or when you feel you don't even know what that first step is about rebuilding that sense of self, as we mentioned before, I felt a feeling of emptiness just for 4 years of college. I can imagine for you from 4 years old till pretty much the end of high school, having soccer as this part of your identity, now it's cut off, and with all the other athletes who go beyond that level, right? They take that young self of them, transition all the way through college where they're only focused on this. They're defined by their sport. And now there is nothing to really define them when that sport is gone. And when they realize this, when it hits them, and it hits clients, some of my clients at different times, but when that happens, one of the major things I notice is this high level of depression for most. And most don't even know that it's depression because they're just trying to figure things out. But the more they try to figure things out and things don't work, the more empty they feel, right? There's already a sense of emptiness leaving that sport. Now, the more they try to fulfill that or fill that void, and the more they struggle with that, the more empty they do feel. And slowly, they lose that sense of self, right? They lose that sense of priorities in their life. And what I notice is similar to me and you, there's that sense of emptiness, but with collegiate level athletes, right? Anxiety, depression is so much more consistent because without the consistent reinforcement of their athletic identity, they just continue to experience self-doubt or a lowered sense of self-worth. And when this happens, you see these high-level athletes go from being at this tip-top shape and them hitting this wall of depression and anxiety that they don't even know how to address because they're thinking about rebuilding their sense of self. And when the depression comes, they're like, maybe we can push this aside so that we can still just keep focusing on the grind. Because if you think about it, that's how they were meant to feel in their sport as well, where if something is wrong, they keep working on themselves. They don't really focus on the mental aspect of it. It's just keep working and keep grinding. But if there's no direction and you keep grinding, right? There is no progress that can come with that. And so I noticed that with the clients I work with, a lot of them try to fill that void, but it ends up leaving them empty. And with that emptiness comes the depression. But what I've noticed also is a lot of isolation, right? That comes with the depression, which is something that I think is important to bring up, because when you don't feel like you connect with the people around you, or you don't have that direction and drive, right? It's easy to fall back and think about, like, I don't want to be with anyone else. I don't want to even try to get out there, because a lot of them tell themselves, we're not meeting other people that think like us. We're not exposing ourselves to like-minded people. So I would just prefer to be alone. And that emptiness then continues to fuel this lowered sense of self-worth, right? Because you go from this person who has such a big community to now being by yourself and only choosing to be by yourself. And I think that is so damaging, because that transition out from college really, for most people, it's difficult. But with athletes in particular, that sense of community that's gone, that may come from isolating or not feeling good enough, right, is one of the biggest components of what made them feel so good. The idea that you can connect with like-minded people and continue to flourish around people who have the same drive as you was a reason as to how they got to the position in the first place as a top-tier athlete. And now we're seeing how the depression, the anxiousness just get in the way and ultimately lead them to isolate and separate themselves. And as they continue to do this, low sense of self-worth is now being brought up, a lack of, just a general apathy. They don't want to go do anything. There's no motivation for themselves. They don't even know how to create a sense of motivation. So for you, Sasa, did you manage any psychological or emotional distress once leaving soccer?
I think it was like a process before I even came to the decision to end it, because, like, referring to my injury, it was like a little bit over a whole year process before I finally decided. And kind of the more I played, the more in pain I was, until I just be more clear on my injury. I had a hip issue, and I went to PT and tried doing those workouts, and it was just my hip was not gonna get better, and if I wanted to continue to play, I would have to push through the pain essentially. And I guess it was a whole process for not just a split decision at that tryout. It was kind of a process of within that year or so that I slowly figured that soccer's not going to be forever, and it in my mind also it wasn't always going to be forever. So in ways I took steps to find different parts of myself that would I can lean into once I was out of the sport. And I guess when it comes to the psychological distress, or just kind of in a way a little bit of a grief process of so much of my life of that relationship with soccer, it was knowing that I can still turn to soccer in different ways than maybe it was that competitive level that I was at. I can still go back to soccer in a less competitive way. I can still watch games and keep up with, professional players and, teams that, I root on and whatnot, and have a different type of relationship with the sport, even though I'm kind of on the outskirts of it at that point.
Yeah. And do you feel like maybe making that decision to not continue in high school and having that maybe your senior year, junior and senior year, to kind of create this new identity with all the people around you, as well as having all of college, do you feel like that was a good buffer for you to create this new identity without tying it down to soccer?
Yeah, I think it just, gave me more time to figure out myself, because I feel like a big pivotal point, athletics aside, is from those early adulthood years into, all of your 20s essentially, and it can continue on. You can always reinvent yourself. You can always find different parts of your identity and lean into that. But I feel like there's so much that happens from 18 to 25 and people can take different pathways within that so much life transition happens that, especially in a way, a different routine of, from grades K through 12, now it's your decision to start making what structure in life you want to take, whether it's within the sports world or not. There's a lot of decisions that come along with that. And I think kind of with my mindset of, knowing that I wasn't going to go play college soccer, I knew and this is kind of in a way my own athletic identity being 2 steps ahead of it, was, taking my time to figure out what I wanted to do and, the people I wanted to be with, and just connection with sport. Like, what does my relationship with sport or soccer look like once I am done with it, even before I knew that I was actually done with it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it sounds like that experience of you being aware of that and kind of planning ahead on that was key, right? And I think with most of the clients we now work with, right, I think because of the high level of competition and constantly grinding for your sport, you don't have that time to really plan it out by the time the sport ends and you're realizing like, oh, now what do I do with my life? And along with this, depression and, psychological distress, anxiousness, emptiness, isolating, all of these things that we notice, we find how not having your sport or not having the environment that comes with that really makes it harder for people to take that next step in their lives. And so another major factor that comes with identity loss is difficulty adjusting to the new roles of your life outside of that. And, I think because the sport is such a big part of their identity, many athletes find it so hard to explore or embrace new roles, outside of their careers within their sport, right? And even if you are, adamant and proactive with, taking the next steps with your professional career and kind of adjusting yourself into it, people don't realize that even though you are, your time can be managed, your work life is good, social life is good, but that purpose that came with the sport always can't be redefined in your life outside of it. That process is a very long process, and you really have to connect with yourself and understand how you viewed the sport to really transition and get that drive that you got from the sport and recreate it in your real life outside of that. So, a lot of times we see a lot of retired athletes struggle to see themselves as capable in non-athletic pursuits, which ultimately creates more psychological distress. And most importantly, I think it limits their growth or how they view the growth they are having. And similarly to everything else, a lot of growth was determined by how well you were doing in your sport, right? For so long. And now it's a completely outside factor that is now determining how you are growing. And a lot of times I see with athletes that, having coaches that kind of push you into, in not only addressing how you play and can help you see the growth you're having throughout your time, a lot of companies may not always do that, right? A lot of work jobs, opportunities that you have post, college life, they're not going to always sit you down, tell you like, this is what we need you to do better. This is not, you have to figure that out on your own. And a lot of athletes struggle to adjust to that because so much of their life, once again, is defined by the growth within the sport and not so much of their growth within other talents, right? That is something that I think only comes later on in life. And, that the main challenge of adjusting to a non-competitive environment, right, is one that I've noticed is something that, once again, it's daunting, it's scary, and it leaves athletes feeling empty, right? So much of their life is determined by this drive, competition, and when they lose that lack of competition, they're just bored all the time. And that adds to emptiness. It adds to feeling a sense of like meaninglessness in your life. And when when you continue to think about all these factors, right, it's so easy to understand how an athlete can crumble after they leave their sport. So much of your life is defined by this. And once you notice from, starting from loss of purpose and direction, and then moving on to understanding the psychological distress you're going through, or understanding how there are now social challenges with not connecting with people, and then creating and understanding how to adjust to a new role, we look at this and view this, and we can see how an athlete can crumble underneath the pressures of all of this. And, as we continue to focus more on this, I think it's also good to know that a lot of athletes take their time working through this by, reaching out to professional help, right? People like us really can sit down with the athletes, understand, what they got out of the sport and how that drove their purpose. And a lot of the times we like to steer them into not just activities that can recreate that feeling, but more of allowing the client or the former athlete to figure out how they want to redirect that purpose. So with one of my clients, he was top tier runner. And for the first 6 months or so of him transitioning into this new life, going through the motions, has his job, has his routine. But a lot of the time he's bogged down by a lot of the injuries he sustained from his time as an athlete. And for him, running wasn't as viable as an option to turn to, which was not just how he was defined, but was his main way of de-stressing, was his main way of kind of calming himself down. And because of his piled up injuries over the years, he can't even do that anymore. And so for him, a long time was set in our sessions talking about what is the purpose you got from all of this? What is, how can we recreate that purpose without running, like physically running? And how can we help you feel as accomplished similarly to how you were, as a collegiate athlete? And one of the things he transitioned into that just fell on his lap, luckily, was him coaching himself, like one-on-one coaching for running, where he didn't have to engage in the sport, but he can utilize what he's learned over the years and pass that on to a middle schooler that he's coaching. And, he just recently, one of his students, got a PR for the highest time. And for him, that was the first time I noticed within him, he was so proud of himself. And I saw that sense of pride, a pride that he didn't ever get from, getting a job, a sense of pride that he didn't get from, creating a life outside of his sport. But it was when he utilized a similar sense of purpose within his athletic career to now transfer that onto someone else. He felt that purpose for, after so long. And it felt like he now found a way to reframe and create a new identity now as a coach, utilizing everything he's learned. So he felt like everything I did in this time as an athlete can now be utilized and helpful for me moving forward. So I thought that was such a beautiful thing when it came to him working through so much of the difficulties of his day-to-day life, but finding out how he can then transfer all the things he learned over the years onto someone new. And now he wants to, coach more and train more. And he's now getting a higher level of purpose from that, even though, he has a good paying job. And this one is he's not focused on the money. He's not focused on the accolades that come with it. He just loves being there and teaching them day after day new techniques to use, sharing what he did and how he became so successful. And now there's a drive and purpose for him to make his students better than he was. And that's how just started. And we're still in this process of creating this new identity, but this is the way he started to rebuild that sense of purpose in his life. And that can come in a lot of different ways for different athletes. Having a family full of athletes, Sasa, or from your own examples, how did you notice like the athletes in your family rebuild that sense of purpose for themselves outside of the sport?
Yeah, I think it's connection of what we kind of do for a living now. And like one of my cousins, super high collegiate athlete, 2 national championships. her academics reflected nutrition and dietetics with a focus in sports and nutrition. And then she reflected back on her kind of athletic identity and her athletic career and, moving that into working with current athletes, former athletes, active individuals of when it comes to their perspective on nutrition and the transition out of that athletic identity and how, kind of that correlates to changes in nutrition and focus on nutrition, or, maybe it's more unhealthy habits or beliefs surrounding food and stuff like that. And then, one of my older brothers, he's a physical therapist, grew up playing soccer his whole life. He went to physical therapy himself. And when he was younger, I would say probably, early teens or so. And that's when he knew he wanted to become a physical therapist because of helping people when it comes to rebuilding their bodies. And then, for myself, I'm more on the mental health realm of things of wanting to help, athletes or, active individuals when it comes to, overall kind of looking at that holistic healthcare perspective of their athletic identity and, whether they, start sessions talking about their athletic identity, whether it is they are transitioning out of kind of the world of sport, looking at all types of lenses of their identity, not just their athletic one, and, looking at the person as a whole when it comes to that. And I think that's like a main hit home thing that we do at Millennium when it comes to working with our clients is we're going to take into account your athletic identity and also look at all the other aspects of yourself and put them all together, because that's who you are sitting in front of us, is all those identities put together into one, and that's who's sitting across from us, who we're talking to.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think with the examples we use, it's a lot of rebuilding that purpose or identity comes back to connecting with their sport in some ways.
Yep.
So with your brother, like physical therapy is him probably helping a lot of people like him work through a lot of the injuries or pain that they've gone through. And he's utilizing a lot of his experiences as an athlete to, understand the people he works with. Similarly to you, in the mental health side of things, working with clients based off of your knowledge of what it was like to be an athlete. And, for a lot of clients, I want to make this clear. It's not always connecting back to sport, right? A lot of them find, that balance or that rebuilding sense or that identity being rebuilt by just channeling and understanding, as you said, that athletic identity and what came with that and repurposing it in other places. So a lot of the clients that I now see want nothing to do with their sport, right? But they don't know how to kind of rebuild this sense of self that comes with that, because they do acknowledge that, sports was such a big part of their lives. But a lot of them heading out of college are like, I'm done. I'm out of here. I'm good. I did what I needed to do and I'm free now. But when they hit that free environment, they're like, okay, I'm now doing the things I've always wanted to do. But sometimes that personal and internal sense of self is never being fulfilled, even with all these endeavors they plan to do and plan to take care of. And sometimes with one of my clients, I noticed just rebuilding his own body the way he wanted to, right? That was the way he felt like he's growing, right? And I saw with him as he focused, because he did let go of his body and he was constantly on this thing of like, I don't have the people around me to help rebuild it. And like, there isn't our mandatory trainings to go to. So pushing myself for that was too hard. And there's so many aspects we looked at, like, the emotional side, physical side, what do you do in your life? And for him, what I noticed was once he just took this step of like, let me focus on going to the gym 3 times a week. And once he did that, he could tell like there's still so much to figure out, he's feeling just a little bit more positive. And then that went from 3 days a week to 4 days a week. And now it's every day that it's happening. And when he started building his body up and he felt like I'm growing and learning so much about myself through this process of just working out constantly, I noticed how then he transferred that understanding from just building himself through, working out to now pushing himself in his professional life, pushing himself in his social life too, where he's like, before it was so easy to make friends. They just came over and all of this. But now he's like, and for so long when he tried to adjust to the social challenges, he was just like, I don't want to reach out to anyone. I don't want to. But once he started working out and that propelled him to do better, feel better, and then propelled him to do better with his professional life, that also fueled him to be more proactive with his social life. And now he has this huge, desire to fulfill this identity of his, to fill that void, to push through that. And so it's different for everyone, right? Sometimes it's not connecting back to the sport. Sometimes it's just connecting back to yourself, right? And so with all of this being said, right, do you have anything else to add, Sasa, to what we were talking about?
I think when it comes to transition out of sport or just transition in general, it can be tough in so many different aspects. And, specifically when it comes to sport, I think the way that the transition starts is very important too, because especially when it comes to sport, it can be injury, it can be the end of high school, the end of college, or whatever it may be. It could be, feeling like at the top of the hill with a championship. It can be feeling like at the very bottom of the hill because you lost the championship. And so, taking an account too of how the journey of your sport and your athletic identity kind of comes to an end, or just how, your last game or your last meet or whatever it is, taking that account too plays a role in the transition, after, sport and your athletic identity. And, I think that's just like a last little point I wanted to, touch on of how it ends, can roll over into, you looking into further purposes and identity after.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, from a therapist point of view, I think if any athletes are listening to this, once you transition out of your sport, the first thing I would say is just to be patient with yourself.
Yep.
It may take, a couple months for you to figure these things out. But, for some of the athletes I work with, it may take you years, and you may not ever see an end in sight, because that rebuilding of your sense of self does take a long time. It took you almost 20 years as a collegiate athlete to build your athletic identity. Now we have to give it time to not just coming to terms with that identity being now not as big of a part of your life, but rebuilding that sense of self. The biggest thing we want you guys to think about is being patient with yourself, and most importantly, being kind to yourself. Because it is so easy to be overwhelmed by all the things we've talked about today and feel so bogged down by not doing what you feel like you're supposed to be doing, and then feeling lost. And so we really do hope that if you are feeling this way, you are really struggling with the loss of identity post, athletic career, reach out to any mental health providers, reach out to former athletes, right? And talk to them about how they transition out, because even if it's not the same way, you've figured out how to work on yourself, you will find a way to find your sense of self. And it just starts with one little thing. And once you get on the rolling with one thing, you will find yourself really being in love with that process of rebuilding your sense of self. And that will be the new journey you take on. So in conclusion to everything we say, right? Identity loss plays a real and central role in the post-sport struggles of former athletes. It influences their emotional well-being, the social connections, and their ability to adapt to life changes. Addressing the issues requires a combination of mental health support, proactive career planning, and opportunities for personal growth. So by redefining their identities and finding purpose outside of sports, former athletes can successfully navigate this challenging transition. And once they're on the ball rolling with this, they find themselves rebuilding that sense of purpose and identity. And then they start recognizing that life can be a little bit easier if I can just take it from this point onwards. So, this is what I hope you guys can understand that comes with identity loss. And you guys understand with athletes specifically that this identity loss process is real, is daunting, and can be very overwhelming. But, you take one step at a time in focusing on you and focusing on what gave you the pleasure within the sport and trying to find other ways to get that same sense of relief in different aspects outside of your sport. And sometimes it may be related to your sport, it may not be related to your sport, but embrace any new opportunity that comes your way, because you don't know where that may start with. So for a lot of athletes listening today, reach out to that mental health provider that that can help you. Reach out to your former athlete friends. Reach out to anyone that can help you take that next step, because it's not just for you, it's for everyone. That life after creating an identity is scary, because rebuilding that sense of self, as we both discussed, is scary. So we ask you and implore you to reach out to any mental health provider. As you know, Millennium can really help you with that. And so I also think it's important to talk about some of the future opportunities that come with Millennium. And, we are also opening up an opportunity to, have group sessions with former athletes to talk about, life after sport. And this is a great way to start with the community aspect, right? A lot of athletes may not connect with others outside of their sport because they don't see a lot of like-minded individuals. And now Millennium is trying to create a group so that these athletes can come together after they're done with their sports and really discuss the challenges and relate to one another's struggle that come with life after college. And so, we are thinking about starting this group. And if you are interested, please reach out to us. We would love to have you join this group and to really share your story and see how it can benefit you just listening to others that are like you. Yeah. And I think that's it for me. So
absolutely. I think you really summed it up, quite nicely, and kind of what you were talking about, reaching out to mental health professionals and, kind of touching on the group that we're starting, Life After Sport, knowing, for the athletes that there are resources and people out there that, you're not alone. This happens more often than you think. And, just, reaching out and trying to find that community that, in a way resembles the team that you once possibly were on, and, finding the commonalities within that too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Sass, I appreciate your time doing this podcast with me. This was another episode of the Millennium Podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah.